All right, here I go. Everybody listening?
Yep.
All right. This story is called... Buddy, please listen. This story is called Disco Jockey, the Prince of Rock and Roll. Once upon a time, in the land of Indiana, there lived a small boy. Guys, I'm trying to tell a story, please. Okay, so in the land of Indiana, there lived a small boy. His name was Disco Jockey. Well, that's what everybody called him. Everybody called him Disco Jockey. His actual name was, his actual name was Franklin Herbert Discotheque Jr. Now, only his grandma called him Franklin Herbert, but everybody else called him Disco Jockey, or Disco for short. Now, Disco Jockey, this kid absolutely loved rock and roll. I mean, he was just like rock and roll everything. He would get in his dad's car whenever they drive someplace, and he'd be like, "Dad, put on some rock and roll." And then when the dad would put it on, he'd be like, "Put it louder, put it louder." He just loved rock and roll, and he always wanted to listen to it, and he talked about rock and roll stuff, and he liked to hear about different bands, and he wanted to go to a rock and roll concert someday. He was just all about rock and roll. So one day, I forgot to tell you something. So down in the basement, their house had a basement. His dad had a secret room that the kids were never allowed to go in. It was kind of like
a scary room.
No, it wasn't scary. It was kind of like
a dad room.
Yeah, like a dad room, like a man cave. It was a man cave. Dad had a man cave, and he did not like the kids to go in there, so they never went in there. They had no idea what was in there. But sometimes
it was a Power Ranger.
Nah, no Power Rangers. It was just a man cave. But sometimes when the dad was in there and they would like walk by, or they were in the basement, they could hear like rock and roll playing. So they just figured he was in there like listening to rock and roll, you know? But they really had no idea what was in the room. So one day, it was like the middle of the night. Yeah, it was a Saturday in the middle of the night. And Disco Jockey, or Disco for short, he just couldn't sleep. He was just laying there in bed thinking about rock and roll and all kinds of other stuff that kids think about. So he's like, you know what? I'm just going to go walk around the house and, just try to like relax my mind and think about something else. So he walked around the house. Everybody was asleep. Dad was snoring. He could hear his big brother in the top bunk tooting in his sleep. And he looked at his sister in her bed, and she had like drool all over her face. And so he walked around the upstairs. Then he went down into the basement. But when he looked back in the corner of the basement where his dad's man cave was, the door was like a little cracked open. He's like, "Oh, that's weird, because Dad always keeps that door closed. Like, why would that door be cracked open? I know Dad's asleep because I just heard him snoring." So he wandered over there, and he knew he wasn't supposed to, because he's never supposed to go into his dad's man cave. But, everybody was asleep. He's like, "Oh, I'm just going to check it out. Who knows? Maybe something interesting back there." So he very quietly and carefully pushed the door open real slow, like,
I can do it. I've got one. I did Power Ranger. I've got one.
Okay. So when the door was open, he didn't see anything because it was dark. So he reached his hand in where he thought the light switch might be. And when he flipped on the switch, what he saw was a whole bunch of electric guitars. And there was drums in there, and a bass guitar, and a saxophone, and all kinds of of like amplifiers,
Rock and roll stuff.
all kinds of rock and roll stuff, a microphone, and there was even rock and roll posters and
Costumes.
rock and roll costumes and albums and it was like a whole rock and roll room. He couldn't believe it. His dad was secretly a rock and roller. He was like, oh, this is so cool. So he was really, really quiet because he didn't want anybody to wake up and know that he'd discovered his dad's rock and roll room. So he went in, and right in the middle of the room on a guitar stand next to a stool, it was the coolest electric guitar in the entire room. He's like, oh, it's amazing. It was like all solid, shiny black. And it was like, it had like one of the Fender heads that's like almost looks like a triangle. Huh?
Lightning bolt.
Like a what?
A lightning bolt.
Yeah.
Like a hog. Like
A hog? No.
Like
Yeah.
mine.
Like a lightning bolt.
A hog. Like my electric guitar.
No, even cooler than that. It was like the coolest electric guitar he'd ever seen. Now, Disco Jockey, which is what everybody called him, he had never played a guitar before, right? He never had any kind of lessons. He was just a little kid. He didn't know anything about playing electric guitar. But he really, really, really wanted to pick up this guitar and even just strum the strings a couple times just to like see what it sounded like and see what he could do. So he plugged...
You sound like a bad guy.
No. He's a good guy. So he picked up the electric guitar. He put the shoulder strap over his shoulder, and he sat down in the stool, and he held it just like he'd seen like other rock and rollers hold their electric guitars. And he plugged it into the amplifier so he could hear the sound. He turned the volume down so that it wouldn't like wake everybody up, but it'd be loud enough so that he could hear it. And then the most amazing thing ever happened. He put his left hand on the neck of the guitar on the strings. With his right hand, he started picking the strings like an electric guitarist would do with a guitar pick. And somehow, miraculously, he could play whatever he wanted. Like without any lessons or anything. He was like one of those like music geniuses, like a savant, like without any lessons. In the very first time ever picking up an electric guitar, he was a rock and roll master. And so he thought of all these songs that he loved, and he started playing them, and he could just play them without even practicing, without even knowing any of the notes. He could just play them all perfectly. And he had so much fun. He was down there playing electric guitar till like the tips of his fingers looked like they were going to start bleeding. And then when he finally finished, he didn't even realize several hours had passed. He'd been rocking out in his dad's rock and roll room with the world's coolest electric guitar for several hours. And when he finally looked up, standing there at the door was his mom and dad. And they absolutely could not believe it. They weren't even mad at him for going into the dad's man cave. They were just like, this kid, what? Huh?
The girl was a spy.
No, there's no spies. It's just a rock and roll kid.
He said the girl was a spy.
So his parents were like, what? Disco Jockey, you're amazing. We didn't know you could play guitar. Where'd you learn how to do that? He's like, I didn't learn. I just picked it up and I could play like anything I wanted to play. It was just so easy. It's just so easy for me. Parents were like, man. And so they started naming off songs. They're like, play some Metallica or play some Foo Fighters or Rolling Stones. Give us some Led Zeppelin and all the songs. Smashing Pumpkins. And all the songs he knew in his head, he would just play them like a professional electric guitar rock and roller. And they just couldn't believe this kid was a genius, a guitar genius. So they sent him to bed because his fingers were raw, and like one of them was even bleeding because he broke the nail on it because he played electric guitar so hard. And they put him to bed because he hadn't slept the whole night. And when he woke up, it was like the middle of the day already, and all the other kids were already outside playing. So he starts walking around the house, and he finds his dad. And his dad is sitting at the computer. And the dad's like, he's like, son, you are absolutely not going to believe what I just did. And the son and Disco Jockey, he's like, what'd you do, Dad? What'd you do? And the dad said, to be continued in part 2.
No. He signed you up for a rock and roll band.
What?
Daddy, please do part 2.
You want to hear part 2?